Hi, DeNight Owl family, and welcome back to DeNight Owl Speaks. You're listening to I Saw You, Episode 2, Reflections After Preaching, a special mini-series that shares the heart behind my latest sermon, the fig tree moment I lived through, and what God revealed after I spoke it out loud. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to go back and listen to Episode 1, my fig tree moment, where I read my personal testimony I shared during my sermon at Hyde Park SDA Church. You can also find this full sermon link in the episode notes if you'd like to experience the entire message as it was preached. In this episode, I want to take you behind the pulpit into my writing process, the moments of wrestling, and how God surprised me in the aftermath. As I was putting the sermon together, The Chosen made me reflect more deeply on how people come to Christ in their personal stories, their inner world. It made me think about my friends. I even thought of the situation of my relationship and how we got together, and how God had been present in the moments where we first prayed for love, for clarity, and for partnership. I reached out to a friend and invited her to share something as part of my message, but still, I wasn't quite sure how it would all come together. I had the idea, I had the title called I Saw You. I knew I wanted it to feel personal and spirit-led, but I was wrestling with the structure, with how the testimonies would fit within how my story would land. And if I'm honest, I hesitated to write about my current testimony. Yes, I've shared it before. I've shared how I lost my memory. I've shared a glimpse of the grief process. People know pieces of my story, the coma, the aftermath, the weight of losing my mom, but very few people know the full story. They don't know what it felt like. The first day I found out what really happened, which took years. They don't know the layers of processing that came years later as I learned new details while growing up. Things I had no memory of because I wasn't awake to witness them, because I was in a coma. When I sat down to prepare this sermon, I had to ask myself, do I really want to bring this story back again? What if it's too heavy for other people to hear? While I've spent years processing what happened, how would others react, hearing it for the first time? What if it doesn't connect with everyone? For months, I left it alone. I sat with the title I Saw You in my spirit, but I didn't know how to bring it to life. It wasn't until late July, maybe August, about a month and a half before I was set to preach, that I finally said, okay, Lord, I'll sit with this. Time was winding down. I didn't have a full sermon. I hadn't fully digested the story of Nathaniel. I had the seed of the message, but not the structure, not the flow, and not the full vision. And when I thought about using my testimony, even thinking about the way God brought my fiance into my life, it still didn't feel strong enough. Not because God wasn't there, but because the story wasn't finished. It is still being written. And then it hit me. The testimony I've been avoiding, the one I didn't want to tell again, it wasn't just a testimony. It was my story. This wasn't just something God brought me through. It was the thing that shaped everything. It shaped how I think. It shaped my relationship with God. It shaped the way I write, the way I speak. It shaped how I interact with others. It shaped how I show up in ministry. It shaped how I lead, how I trust, and how I process pain and purpose. It wasn't just a moment in time. It was the moment that birthed my calling. From the way my dad and my sister had to suffer, to the trauma of losing my mom, to the aftermath of remembering anything but waking up in a hospital bed. This story was bigger than me. It was how I became who I am: the elder, the speaker, the writer, the woman who now tells stories like this because she finally embraced her own. So I knew it was more than acceptable, more than reasonable. It was necessary for me to tell this story again, because this is where the heart of "I saw you" truly lived. It was in that coma, under that metaphorical fig tree, where God saw me sleeping, where I had no idea what happened, where I woke up 4 days later with no memory of how I got there. And yet, He saw me, and He still sees me. When I write sermons, I don't pick topics randomly. It takes time, because I want to speak from a place of depth, not just surface level inspiration. Every sermon I've given has been kind of a personal reflection, a moment where I could say, this isn't just a teaching, this is something I lived. So when it came time to preach "I saw you," I knew I didn't want it to just be a message. I wanted it to be interactive, something that helped people reflect on their own fig tree moments, something visual, something tangible. When I finally started reflecting more seriously on the story of Nathaniel, I honestly got some insight, even some advice from ChatGPT on how to turn my sermon into something more interactive. It helped me think about how to engage the congregation just beyond listening. I had already written all of my sermon, but I didn't know how to bring the visual and participatory elements together. I knew I wanted to do something with the image of a tree. I knew I wanted to ask questions. I wanted people to reflect and not just listen. So I started to ask a few members of my congregation ahead of time if they would be willing to share and write their own testimonies during the service. I knew I wanted the fig tree to be more than a metaphor. I wanted it to be something people could see, touch, write. That's when the idea of a physical fig tree came to mind, along with index cards for people to write their reflections on. I also created a graphic of a man sitting under a fig tree, with key reflection questions to guide the experience. The final week before the sermon, everything began to come together. I had a complete draft of my sermon, not with just the main points, but the interactive moments woven in. I knew where I'd pause to invite people to reflect, where I'd ask them to think about the word someone once used to describe them, and whether they believe that word. That idea, the word activity, came to me while I was trying to fall asleep. I remember at a gathering with my elders, we had a activity. Everyone had to draw a heart shape on a piece of paper and tape it to their back. And the others had to walk around and write one word or a phrase describing the person. When it came time to look at our words and choose one that stood out or that shocked us, mine was victorious. And that word stuck with me because I didn't choose it. It was chosen for me. It perfectly described my life, even when I didn't see it yet. God was speaking through that person to me that my life had been victorious. So I integrated that into the sermon too, because Jesus described Nathaniel before Nathaniel even introduced himself. And somehow Nathaniel recognized himself in what Jesus said. That's what I wanted for the congregation, to reflect on the words spoken over them, to ask, do I believe this? Do I agree with and how God sees me? That moment flowed perfectly into my spoken word testimony, which I wrote out and shared in episode 1 of this series. And even then, I wasn't sure it would be enough, so I went deeper. I reflected back to a specific moment, a night where I was angry with God, crying, questioning why I had to go through all of this, why He left me to take care of my sister, why He took mommy, why I had to be the one who survived. And I wrote that night down like a conversation because that's what it felt like. I asked questions, and the answers, whether from the Holy Spirit or my own quiet wrestlings, came through. I added that conversation into my sermon. When I rehearsed it, just to see how long everything would take, I realized the message was heavier than I thought. What I thought would be 30 to 45 minutes turned into a full hour, but I knew the wait was worth it. Because this wasn't just a message, it was a release. As the day approached, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stress or overthink. I was just going to let God lead. I had already done the work, and now it was time to let the moment speak for itself. I arrived Friday afternoon before the sermon and focused entirely on getting my physical fig tree set up. When I got home, I didn't even open my notes. Everything was ready. The activities were packed, the trees, the cards, and the questions were done. On the morning of my sermon, I still didn't read through it again. I just put the finishing touches on my tree. I didn't want to be in my head. I wanted to be in the Spirit. During praise and worship, I sat and I listened and let the music minister to me. And when it was time for me to go up, I went. Because the sermon was interactive, it felt relaxing and inviting. I wasn't nervous like I usually am. I joked with the congregation, smiled, showed them the fig tree, asked them to guess what I was talking about, actually brought fig trees to have them guess. I introduced the cards and the activity, and I felt at peace. There was a confidence in what I was bringing, not in myself, but in the assignment God had given me. And yet, as I began to share my actual story and read the testimony, the emotions returned. When I had rehearsed the sermon earlier, I knew there were parts that would make me choke up, parts that still hurt even after years of healing, but I told myself, I will get through this. I thought I was prepared, but the moment in the service hit differently. I could feel the tension, not just in myself but in the room. Even before I shared my testimony, as others reflected on a word of a comment that they got from someone, as others was talking to each other, while people were writing on their index cards and reflecting on a moment where they didn't feel seen by God. Those moments where God was with them in their quiet place. The moments where my volunteers got up and talked about their testimonies. They shared that while they knew that this moment was coming, and they spoke about their experiences and the moments when they knew that God saw them, they thanked me for allowing them to have this opportunity, not just for me because I asked, but for themselves, that it helped them even process and realize their own journey. As they shared their testimonies and others shared theirs, the weight was there. When I reached the part about the night I questioned God, about being left to raise my sister after losing mommy, tears came. I couldn't hold them back. Normally, I'm open about my story. And I don't usually cry when telling it to someone. I've shared it so many times that I've built a strength around it. But this time, with the eyes of the congregation on me and the presence of God so strong in the room, I broke. My friend came to support me. I saw my fiance in my peripheral vision, ready to come up, but ended up sitting down. Even after the sermon ended, when I invited the pastor to pray, and after I sang the appeal song, I started crying again. Not because I was overwhelmed by performance, but because my heart was still processing everything. And in that moment, it officially felt like the culmination of my purpose, even though it was already in progress. While I've been sharing my story for years with individuals and working on different projects to tell it through various mediums, often in quiet, private, or more secretive ways, this marked the beginning of something new. It showed me there was no turning back now. This was me sharing in a public and open setting, letting my guard down and stepping fully into what God called me to do. It was like everything God had walked me through, the loss, the healing, my ministry, the waiting, the writing, had all led to this divine collision of calling and clarity. After the service, people came up with hugs and affirmations saying, "I didn't expect to cry." That testimony was powerful. I had no idea you went through all of that. Thank you for sharing your truth. Even members from Jehovah's Shalom were in town and asked me to pray for them. That alone made me pause, not because I didn't want to, but because it made me see myself differently. Not in a prideful way, but in a humbling, God-glorifying way. It reminded me that God truly used me, and He used my story to reach hearts. The feedback afterward was overwhelming in the best way. Humbling, affirming, and holy. People cried, hugged me, and shared their own stories. Some said, "That's what I needed." Others said, "I haven't cried like that in a while." And that's when it clicked for me. The very testimony I almost didn't share was the one God still wanted to use. And here's what I learned. God doesn't need you to be original. He needs you to be obedient. Your fig tree moment doesn't lose its power just because it's familiar to you. And sometimes what you think you're done sharing is just the beginning to bless someone else. This experience also reminded me that our calling isn't measured by how perfectly we deliver a message, but how deeply we allow God to flow through it. The anointing wasn't in my notes, it was in my tears. And when I let go of control, God took over. So now I ask you, have you had a fig tree moment? A season, a cry, a prayer, a breakdown, a hidden place where only God saw you? If so, don't keep it buried. Speak it, write it, share it. Not for likes, not for platform, but for freedom. Because every time you testify, you remind the enemy that you survived what was meant to silence you. And if this reflection stirred something in you, I want you to take a moment to go back and maybe listen to episode 1 to hear my full testimony, my reflections, or watch the full sermon. Sometimes revisiting the moment reminds us how far God has brought us and how He's still writing the story. Thank you for listening and for walking through this sacred place with me. This is DeNight Owl Speaks, and this was episode 2, Reflections After Preaching. Until next time, stay seen, stay known, stay victorious.